Good afternoon, and welcome to the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies program. This afternoon, Chernobyl responder, Jewish refugee radiation expert. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Alla Shapiro into our conversation today. And I want to mention that this is really an introductory event, that Dr. Shapiro is joining us by Zoom today. But we'll be coming to the University of Nebraska, Omaha in May to give a series of lectures on her research and engage in conversations with the Jewish community. So this is the beginning of a series of events highlighting Dr. Shapiro's work and an opportunity to discuss her experiences, which are so pertinent today amidst current events. Before I get started, I want to say just a few words about the Schwab Center for those of you who may be attending your first event. The Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies is an academic center located within the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. We've been in existence since 2009, and I'm Dr. Jeanette Gabriel, the director of the center. We do public programming and support academic research throughout the university, focusing on issues of Jewish and Israel studies. We also, of course, support student research and student research within the broader community among the middle school and high school student base here in the city of Omaha. So without further ado, I'd like now to turn to an introduction of our speaker today. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Alla Shapiro, who was born in the Ukraine and was a first physician responder to the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. Following years of discrimination as a Jewish citizen in the Soviet Union, Alla and her extended family immigrated to the United States in the late 1980s. And that is really the focus of our conversation today. She completed a residency in general pediatrics at Georgetown University Hospital, followed by a fellowship in pediatric hematology oncology at the National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute. From 2003 to 2019, Dr. Shapiro worked as a medical officer at the Counterterrorism and Emergency Coordination Staff at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So very pleased to welcome Dr. Shapiro. Now, before I begin the question and answer session, I want to just explain the format that we're going to use today. Dr. Shapiro and I will be engaging in conversation for about the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. We'd ask you to please remain on mute and to enter your questions into the chat. And we'll make sure to extend those to Dr. Shapiro today. So thank you very much for following those guidelines. So we're looking forward to a wonderful event. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Shapiro. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shapiro.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. And I would like to thank Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies for organizing this event. And my special thanks go to Dr. Jeanette Gabriel, who shares her vast knowledge with generosity.
So I'd like to begin, Dr. Shapiro, by asking you why your family left the Soviet Union.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of the pivotal questions, and I think that you partially answered it during your introduction. So my family and I fled the oppressive Soviet Union in 1989 after decades of the open hostility towards Jews. Anti-Semitism was encouraged by the government. The organized practice of Judaism became unsafe and nearly impossible. Professional lives and careers of my family and other Jews were affected as well. The other reason was the bureaucratic lies and cover-ups in the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster were the last straw that caused my family to pack up our lives and leave the country that we could no longer call home. This experience of leaving a hostile and repressive homeland, whether forced or voluntarily, is a life-changing in every sense.
Yes, and could you elaborate the story your own family faced?
Yeah, since I was a child, I understood that persecution of Jewish people was an established fact of life. Members of my immediate family had prepared me for it early by sharing their life stories. My grandmother memories frequently went back to the World War II. She told me about one of my aunts who was a young dentist at that time and who died in Kiev in September of 1941 when the Germans invaded Kiev during the time of the World War II. The Nazis made mass arrests and executed Jews who lived in the city. One day in September of 1949, my aunt became sick. She had a high fever and could not go to work. Her neighbors, an Ukrainian couple who lived next door, heard that some Ukrainians had betrayed their Jewish neighbors. They offered that my aunt stay at their apartment, hoping that if Germans comes, she would be protected. And the wife even suggested that she will pretend that my aunt has an Ukrainian passport and was willing to do that, to show that. So when I've heard the story, I was really excited and happy ending of this story. But my grandma really looked away from me and whispered that two Nazis broke into the apartment, quickly crossed the small room and approached the bed where my aunt was living. The blanket was covered her body almost up to her eyes, reaching her eyes. She appeared to be asleep. One of the Germans reached to the blanket and pulled with his gun, pull it down. So my aunt was sweating, her fever broke down, and she started talking. Every word that she pronounced was in Yiddish. So the Nazis pulled her down on the floor and she continued muttering, just couldn't stop talking. One of the Nazis pulled her out of the door, two others helped him. They dragged her to the car, shut the door and took off. This is how the story ended for me at that time. When I grew older, my parents told me about Babi Yar, the area outside of Kiev that became a site of a massacres during the German campaign in Ukraine in 1941 during World War II. So my aunt died during this first best documented fact. It was September 29, and during the days 29 to September 30th, over 34,000 of Jews were killed, and my aunt was one of them. So then the other older generation of my family is my grandmother, whose life was a long struggle. In 1950s, her husband, my grandfather, had been imprisoned for 6 months. His arrest was based on allegations that he'd been hiring too many Jews to work at the glass factory where he was a chief engineer. In prison, he survived a heart attack and overcame the false accusation. But after his release, his life was not the same. He felt that all the values that he treasured about life and his country were swept away. My grandfather was never able to heal these broken pieces of his life, and his health deteriorated. He succumbed to a second heart attack when he was 58 years old while climbing the stairs to his office.
So that's a lot of traumatic experiences that your family went through generation after generation. Can you talk a little about your mother, who is also a doctor and was accused of being part of the doctor's plot? And tell for audience members who may not know what the doctor's plot is, a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm moving to the next generation, and this will be part one will be a quick journey with my mother's professional struggle. By the way, my mom is 96 today, and she lives close to me in Bethesda, and she's writing books, and she's very active. So yes, you might be familiar with the doctor's plot, but briefly, in December of 1953, news of chains of events that became known as the doctor's plot really rocked the country and the entire world. In the so-called doctor's plot, 9 Soviet doctors, 7 of them were Jewish, were accused of espionage and terrorist activities against the leaders of the Soviet government. They also were accused and convicted of taking part of a larger plot, which would encompass Western imperialists and Zionists, how they were called by Soviets, to kill the top Soviet political and military leadership, and allegedly were conspired to murder Stalin. Being a young doctor at that time, my mom was identified as a go-between for her mentor and his colleague, who was a prominent physician in Moscow, who treated many of the Soviet government and leading generals of the Soviet army in the Kremlin hospital. They all were arrested along with Stalin's personal doctor. My mom was ultimately cleared. Many others were not so fortunate. And after Stalin's death, 7 of the doctors were cleared, and they were immediately released, but 2 others died in jail. So my mother, to continue her story, she became an acclaimed physician in Kiev, and she was specialized in kidney diseases, and she was considered an expert in the Republic of Ukraine. She worked on the cutting edge of scientific and clinical discoveries in diagnosing and treating kidney conditions. And during this time, dialysis, which you probably not even medical person heard the word, is a process using machine that will purify the blood of a person with kidney diseases. And this was big advances in the entire field of medicine. And the very first international conference on hemodialysis was held in Kiev in early 70s. And my mom was invited because her breaking discoveries, but she was only allowed to attend as a silent guest, meaning that officials forbade my mom from presenting her groundbreaking work on treatment patients with kidney diseases. And no explanation was given to why my mom could not present her results, a result of her research, but everybody understood this unspoken ugly truth. When her name would be announced, then the scream would be, she is Jewish. And she really has not just this story, but many other very similar, that she never was allowed to present at any of the conferences, was never allowed to go abroad, as most of the people at that time. But this taught me a lot, and I can jump into share memories
Yes.
of.
Well, first of all, it's very inspiring to hear that it's your mother's birthday today. She's 96 and flourishing. Please send our birthday greetings to her. I mean, it is a really moving story that you tell about her, and I'm very interested for you to talk a little bit about how these generational experiences, particularly of your mother, impacted you and your generation. But before we get there, could I ask you to tell us a little bit more about your mother's imprisonment?
My mother was not in prison. My grandfather, maybe it was not so clear. My grandfather was in prison because he was hiring too many Jews. My mom was not in prison, but she was suspended from her job. This was a time when she was defending her dissertation and was supposed to go to Moscow and do that, but this all was postponed at that time indefinitely, and she was able to defend her dissertation and became a PhD right
Wow,
after Stalin's death.
that's stunning. All of us who have completed dissertations know what a stressful time that is. So compounding these type of events on top of it, she sounds like really an incredibly strong figure. Can you talk about how she inspired you and her experiences impacted you?
Well, first of all, my mother was a doctor, and uh, the doctors in the former Soviet Union has slightly different duties than doctors in the United States. Anybody, any patients was allowed to call the doctor, including my mom, at any time during the day or night, any holidays. And since we shared small apartment, we had only one phone, which was landline, in the hallway, in the corridor, and I always was listening to what my mom was telling and consulting her patients. And this really made me so dedicated to what she is doing and admiring what she is doing that I also wanted to be a doctor. And at that time, I really did not realize too much that my career, despite of what I've heard from other generation, I thought, no, it's not going to happen to my generation. We live in a different world. I want to be a doctor. I want to do research, and I will present at the meetings. So this was my dream.
And before we go into opening it up to Q&A, can you tell us a little bit about how you felt your career was specifically impacted by anti-Semitism?
Yes, definitely. First of all, I was afraid to go to any synagogue in Kiev. There were 3 synagogues in Kiev. 2 of them were converted to one of the puppet theater, and another became a movie theater. The only working synagogue was old, and it really became a state-of-the-art surveillance system. Anybody who would go to synagogue was asked to show their ID, share their work, and home address. And then this information was passed by the KGB agents to the supervisors where these people work. And then the consequences of such disclosure really were different, from warning to the person would say, I would never swear, I will never attend the synagogue again, or it was a termination from work. So I was afraid to go there. And also, I knew that there was unwritten so-called Jewish quota in places mainly for scientific and academic institution in the Soviet Union, which was intended to limit the number of Jewish students. So accordingly, my parents drilled into me that from the early age that if I want to go to a good college, I have to know the subject, not to get A, but like with A and 3 pluses or 4 pluses. And I took this advice very close, my parents' advice very close to my heart. And I'm afraid that I'm carrying it through my entire life. So when I started the medical school, there were two Jewish people, I was included, in a class over 150 students. So in my first year of this best medical school in Ukraine, I experienced really very traumatic event. So at the beginning of the school year, the dean announced that there would be a competition for academic excellence, and students were divided in the groups between 12 and 15 people, and the group which will be the winner will get a prize. They will all expenses paid, and the group of 12 or 15 is going to Poland. And my group won. So the announcement was greeted with enthusiasm and hugs, but this joy was really short-lived. After a quick review of the names of the winners, the department of the medical school unanimously agreed that sending abroad a group of students that include just one member with an obviously Jewish last name would be politically unacceptable. So the hard-earned prize to Poland was canceled without further explanation or reward. And of course, I felt like an outcast, guilty of something that I was not sure what, and I didn't have any control. And I have the last one that really propelled me to leave the country. So experience from the Chernobyl during and the aftermath revealed that doctors lacked basic knowledge of the impact of the radiation on human health. So moreover, everybody had their unfounded opinion and about this invisible threat. So everybody realized it, and to achieve the goal, just improve this situation, the Ukrainian government decided to open a new Institute of Radiation Biology in Kyiv. And I became aware that our professor who was in charge, who was my supervisor, was allowed to take 3 people from our clinical center to work with him at this place. And this was my passion, my obsession. I wanted to do something to help patients who were exposed to radiation. And my former boss was was going to become a director of this institute. So I was 100% sure that I am already there. But there was little stone between that. My supervisor was supposed to share his 3 candidates with the Minister of Health, just for, for a protocol. So he came to the Minister of Health and presented 3 candidates. 2 of my colleagues and friends had very clear history, Ukrainians, nothing that would really be a stopper of their conversation between minister and my boss. So when he came across my name, he pronounced it loud and asked my supervisor, and what is this? He even didn't ask, who is this? He asked, what is this? The minister could not even envision a Jewish doctor as a senior staff member at the premier institute in Ukraine. So he felt ashamed that this dirty doctor submitted an application for a position there. So at that moment, I felt really that my future is dying in front of me. And I could not accept this anymore. And I immediately portrayed that my daughter, who was 6 years old at that time, would face the same grim reality. I came home, and after talking to my boss, and without any hesitation, I said to my family that it's time to leave.
Oh, thank you. That's it's such a moving story to hear how restricted the possibilities were for you professionally and how that must have impacted you personally. I'm sure many of the people who are here have questions they want to ask. Before I open up to Q&A, I just want to mention, of course, Dr. Shapiro's memoir, Doctor on Call, Chernobyl Responder, Jewish Refugee Radiation Expert. We will have copies available when Dr. Shapiro joins us at the Jewish Community Center on May 12th for a special luncheon. And she'll be able to sign the copies of the books for local here to Omaha. You'll be able to get a signed copy at that time. And we'll be having a deeper conversation in May about the experiences that you had leaving the Soviet Union and coming to the United States, being a stateless person in Rome. So really looking forward to continuing that conversation in just a few months. So I now want to ask if there are questions from the audience, if you could please put them in chat and we can pass them along and have a broader conversation with the speaker. I'm sure many of you have questions that you'd like to ask. We'll start with Rich Juro's question. He's asking about the long-term effects of Chernobyl and asking if you can specifically discuss the effects on Kiev residents and on young women having healthy babies.
Yeah, it's a very timely question, and the research was going on for 35 years. And there is a lots of discrepant data, and I just want to warn from very beginning that I always try to collect the most the data from the most reasonable sources. And since I spent 20 years of my life just following this and presenting the data at the conferences, I can say that the long-term results from radiation in Ukraine and Kiev in particular, the number of cancers, this is what always follow the long-term effects. And from this standpoint, thyroid cancer, well, it's usually 10 to 15 years, so we don't consider it a long-term effect. But there are lots of cancers that women acquired as a long-term, and it's colon cancer. We don't have the great explanation for that, but it's not only for Kiev. The same results we have from Finland, from Scandinavia and other Scandinavian countries where the radiation plume went first. So this is one. The other long-term could be cardiovascular. So not just cancer. Now the doctors and scientists dividing all these long-term consequences in few groups. One is cancer related, another is non-cancer. So for non-cancer, we have mostly cardiovascular diseases. And the other that I want to emphasize, and to be maybe one of take-home messages, the psychological impact of Chernobyl. And it pertains to any disaster. Would it be COVID, would it be war? Psychological impact, it's really what makes the population who survived, they made them have depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is what psychological impact causes or means. And these wounds they don't show right away. For example, for the fighters during Chernobyl, or liquidators who were in the area of this nuclear war, they did not feel anything while they are there. But when over time, they start having depression and anxiety, increased level of alcoholism, and increased rate of suicide.
Thank you for bringing that up. This aspect of Chernobyl, I think, is not often discussed, and is really fascinating to think about, that this really is a deeply traumatic event for all of those who encountered it. So are there other questions? If not, I'll give you time to ponder your questions. And in the meantime, I really wanted to follow up, Dr. Shapiro, on your point about the general hostility within the Ukraine towards being Jewish, and how that felt for you in your day-to-day life with your neighbors.
My neighbors in Ukraine?
Yes.
Yeah, I was very lucky and blessed with the neighbors wherever I go, was it in Ukraine, then as a stateless in Italy, and then as an American citizen. It's just my best of my luck. But of course, not everybody had wonderful neighbors. And having the neighbors, some people, again, this memories from the World War II, when Ukrainians were betraying their neighbors, that's what I mentioned in the story, in the chronicle about my aunt, that this was a pretty common, but neither me nor my family never experienced that. It was even opposite. And I will never forget that in 1985, just before Chernobyl, the rumors started spreading across Kiev. The pogrom, I know that the word pogrom, it's each language is the same. When there is an attack on Jewish population, it's inevitable. So everybody were, of course, in panic and didn't know what to do, where to go. Our neighbors, who were our next door neighbors from the apartment building on the same floor, they offered to take my daughter and myself to live with them until this situation resolved. And this was, I don't really like this cliche, history repeats itself, but this was something exactly that my aunt experienced in 1945 when her neighbors were trying to hide her. And this was the example of kindness of people, of their generosity, and really they were not afraid of their lives, because if they're hiding Jewish people and someone who doesn't want this to happen comes into their apartment, they will be the victims, and then subsequently we will be too. So this is my answer.
Fascinating. It's so important, especially when we look at Ukraine today, to think about how important it is to highlight the Ukrainian people who have historically stood up for the Jewish population. And also, it's so fascinating to think about people really of our generation being threatened with pogroms, right? This is something that the American Jewish community sees as a problem in the far past. So really appreciate you bringing up that story to remind us how present of a threat the pogrom really is. I wanted to share a few questions from the audience that connect to this. Warren Hill is asking that since President Zelensky in Ukraine is of a Jewish background, do you think that there has been a change overall in the attitudes of the Ukraine, or do you think that there was always a very mixed atmosphere towards the Jewish community?
Well, I don't have a direct answer to this question. And the reason that I didn't follow the events very closely since Zelensky or other president were there. But from my personal experience, I was in Kiev 15 years ago. Of course, it's not, could be different today, could be some dramatic changes, but it was 15 years ago when I was invited to an international conference dedicated to 20th Chernobyl anniversary. And I was invited as a speaker on behalf of the United States. And I spent 5 days in Kiev. And one of the experience that I just accidentally became a bystander, how young people were talking about Jews, it was as horrible as it was 30 years ago. But again, one example is not a statistic. I have only 2 close friends who live in Kiev, and when we talk, we usually don't talk about this.
I understand, and I so appreciate your scientific view of the difference between statistics and data and stories, right? It's so scholarly. Can you tell us one of the questions of how did your family end up in the DC area?
Well, again, this is a good luck and blessing of having neighbors, not real neighbors. The synagogue, at that time, there was big influx of Jewish people, especially as my family rejected the entry visa to the United States when we were in Italy. There were 6, according to different sources, 6,000 to 8,000 Jews who were stuck in Italy until we all were allowed to go to the United States. And the place, lots of people went to New York, lots of people went to Chicago. In this area, we had my mom's former colleague who at that time, not even colleagues, they went to medical school together in Kiev. And this was, you can imagine, 70 years ago. So my mom's friend, they were in touch all their lives. She had relatives and she came to the US, to this area, way before we came. And she was an active member of the synagogue Bethel, one that we live close to. And she notified the synagogue community that family of 7, and I used to call us Magnificent 7 for some reasons, that family of 7 is arriving to our area. And they gave us green light, and 3 people, absolute strangers for us at that time, met at the airport and drove us to our first residency in Maryland, where 7 of us lived for 1 year, and then we found our different places to live, but we always, all of us, stay in this area, and we consider this our home.
That's such a lovely story. We have a similar type of network that existed here in Omaha that we're, of course, looking forward to discussing in May with Shirley Goldstein and the organizing that she did to bring about 200 families to resettle here in the Omaha area. It's so important to think about how those social networks really created space and opportunity for refugee resettlement. I know you've done some interviews recently about concerns over the recent concerns over the use of nuclear weapons and Putin's veiled threats over using nuclear weapons. Can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts have been in terms of the use of threatening nuclear attacks and how that affects events? I know you're not speaking, of course, as a political scientist, but as a scientist. But your thoughts on the impact of a nuclear disaster, the possibilities of such.
Well, the possibility of nuclear disaster has been discussed for decades, way before Putin started threatening us. And we have countries with the long missiles that wanted just to show their strength. And also we have nuclear power stations across the country. In 30 states in the US, there are 99 nuclear power stations. And of course, it's a staggering number if you think if anything could happen. On the other hand, the design of those nuclear facilities are much better, not even comparable with Chernobyl. Plus, over this year, the personnel is much more trained, but there is always a threat. There is always nuclear threat. Would it come from terrorists or accident? There are many scenarios of it, and I am planning to address them all when I visit Omaha. I will prepare for any possibility, but we are much better prepared. I mean, we in this country compared to total unpreparedness in Ukraine. And the biggest gap I see, not as a politician, as a scientist, that the general public is not prepared. General public has no awareness of the possibility of a nuclear disaster.
It's chilling to think about. So we have some really interesting questions asking about the displaced refugees today, who are, of course, 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees who will need to reconstruct their lives. And the question is asking about how challenging it was for you and your mother to resume your professional careers as refugees in the United States.
Well, thank you. This was very difficult. I'll start with my mom. When we arrived, my mom was 65 years old, so there was no way that she could apply for any, residency or take medical exams. I was the only one, the oldest in my residency. I was 38 years old, but so there's no people who are 65. So my mom never thought of continuing her career as a clinician, but she absolutely could not live without work. And her first application, again, when she was 65, she submitted to George Washington University, and she was accepted to work in the lab. So she worked there as a lab technician, was learning language, was learning what they're doing there. It was very far from her clinical research. It was very basic science oriented. And then after 2 years with George Washington University, the contract expired, and she applied to the National Institute of Health. And she was immediately accepted there. And she spent, I think, 10 years working, also doing lab work. She'd been a co-author for quite a few scientific articles that her lab was writing and publishing. So this was my mom journey. With me, I wanted to be a physician. And even though I was told it's a very difficult way, why don't you do research? For example, NIH, the best place in the world, and I still didn't want it. So I spent 2 years preparing for medical exams. And then after I passed medical exam, basic science, clinical science, and then combination, and English also was a required exam, I applied for a residency at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, DC. And I completed 3 years as a resident. And after that, when again, dedicated friends were saying, no, it's enough, just go clinical practice, private practice. I said, no, I want to be who I was. And I applied to National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute, and I was doing a fellowship in pediatric hematology oncology for 3 years. And after that, I applied and worked for the FDA as a medical officer in the oncology division for 3 years. After the September 11, the Congress charged FDA to open the new Office of Counterterrorism, which would help pharmaceutical companies and academia develop drugs against radiation exposure.
So in many ways, you had to go through your training twice.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why I like to say I became a doctor again, which is what it is.
That's really such a tremendous amount of work to be able to continue the work in your field. I wonder if you think that a lot of refugees who came at the same time were able to also sort of step back into their careers.
Well, I never followed the numbers, but I do know that there are both some people who really wanted to be the doctors. Many of them accomplished this goal. Some families, for example, if there were 2 doctors, they had to sacrifice one spouse, one of the spouses, so another one can work and provide living for the family while other one will be studying for the exams, because you'll study for exams from 8 in the morning till 8 p.m. and then every day after, no weekends, no holidays. So someone in family has to work. So in these cases, it was much more difficult. The family had to split their responsibilities. But some of the people that I know, they never tried. They just followed some other routes, mainly in medicine, but sometimes the doctor could be, I don't know, a musician.
Sure. So we have a specific question about going back to the problem of potential accidents with power plants. We have a question. Do you think that all households should have a supply of potassium iodide in view of the possibility of terrorism with an accident of a power plant or a nuclear device?
Okay, this I can assure. Please do not make stocks of potassium iodine in your place. And there are 2 reasons for that. First, each drug, including potassium iodine, has its shelf life. So if you buy it today and accident occurred in 5 years, the drug is not effective anymore. This is kind of more personal answer. From the government standpoint, and here I can talk as a former government employee, that potassium iodine is in our strategical national stockpile. And this is the place, many places there's across the United States. We just don't know where, at least I don't know where they are, but these places, strategical national stockpiles, they have potassium iodine, lots of pills and liquids for children. And according to the planning, if the event that result in radiation, it's only radioactive iodine, which could be treated with potassium iodine, not other radioactive elements. So if somewhere explosion and the nuclear power station happened, or just a threat, then the potassium iodide will be distributed to that area within 20 to 24 hours. doesn't matter how far from the epicenter this happened, where the state is located, the government will provide this. And then it will go to doctor's offices, to hospitals. So it should not be the situation that I experienced in Kiev after the Chernobyl, that we had no idea what is potassium iodine, and then rumors started spreading, and all iodine was gone from the pharmacies, and people started feeding their children with this iodine, not knowing the dose. And in many cases, children developed gastric bleeding. And I was called to the emergency room at the hospital where I worked few times when children were brought from home by the ambulance with the gastric bleeding because they have open ulcers from the potassium iodide. So this is maybe even more convincing not to have it at home, not to empty, because we should all get it as needed.
Oh, that's so important. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's very reassuring to hear the specifics of the government preparedness. I want to wrap up. We do have a few questions we weren't able to get to, but there will be an opportunity to spend time with Dr. Shapiro in Omaha in May, and we're so looking forward to you coming to town and spending some time with us as a community, a scientific community, an academic community, and of course, within the Jewish community. I wanted to finish up with a question that's asking you to a double question. One is about any anti-Semitism you experienced after you came to the United States, and then in a larger scope, do you think it's possible to live in a world where history stops repeating this cycle of singling people out based on their religion and ethnicity?
Well, first part of the question is very easy. I never ever experienced any anti-Semitic moves or actions toward me or even my family. This is my very honest answer. With regard to how the world can live without anti-Semitism, based on many centuries of history from different countries, it shows its existence. And I don't really have an answer what to do with this. And the very disturbing that anti-Semitism is now growing up in the United States. And I was just curious, in numbers, usually I don't play with a number, that in 70 years, more than 70 years after World War II, we are still witnessing the increase in the US. And according to some sources, close to 2,000 cases in America of harassment, vandalism, and this is all since 1994, and this study stopped in 2017. So it's a big number, and people are concerned about the sources. Some students say it's on our campuses. We are noticing this with the students. It's a difficult question. I would like to be optimistic and see that maybe future generations will live in a different world, but I'm not sure.
Yes, well, I think that's probably as honest as we can be, that that anti-Semitism is probably here to stay in the short term, and we have not moved past a world of hatred. But it's so important to think about the need of refugees of finding safe places, and appreciate you spending time today talking with us about your personal experiences, um, and sharing so much of your family stories and hearing about your amazing mother. So I want to thank you, Dr. Shapiro, and thank everyone for joining us today, and say again how much we look forward to having hosting your visit here in person, and asking everyone in the audience to save the date of a luncheon on May 12th where you can spend time with Dr. Shapiro.